Howdy y'all, welcome back and namaste. Welcome back to another action-packed, exciting episode of this philosophical quest. Today we're going to be doing chapter 5, talking about the first principles. And I'm going to start by just contextualizing, getting us back into the groove, remember what we're doing, why we're studying this, and review epistemology, and then dive into what we'll call what we need to call a postmodern meta-narrative of philosophyology, which is this really pretentious, fancy way of saying we're going to kind of cover a lot of history in a short period of time, not for the sake of really understanding Descartes and Hume and Kant, but instead to understand the history of epistemology in a brief way so that we can really get our heads around some of the issues that are involved in epistemology and finding out where to anchor our knowledge, so to speak. So I want to start by, reviewing this overview of this philosophical quest, which is not just an overview of the course, but also, image of systematic philosophy, doing philosophy systematically so that we can think through complex philosophical issues in ways that can give us some confidence about what we know in our, decision-making process, which reduces anxiety and all those lovely kind of things. But also to help us understand ethics and how we can form, how we can become ethical beings and achieve our existential purpose and find meaning and purpose in life, all those kind of things this little chart helps us to do. And so in the past, we've talked about ontology and existentialism and focusing in the most previous chapter on death. Today, we're shifting out a little bit to what we call the first principles of philosophy. So understanding epistemology again, but what grounds our knowledge, and turning now to those first fundamental questions, those three questions that we've previously referred to as anthropology, cosmology, and theology or existentialism. Namely, those questions: who am I? Why am I here? And where am I? Who am I? Where am I? And why am I here? Right? So that's kind of where we're trying to go and understanding these first principles, why these are the first principles, what makes them first, not just because they are critically important questions, but there's something about them that's just so deeply fundamental. As I've emphasized before, you can't answer any one of these questions without simultaneously answering all three. And today we're going to kind of dig into why is that the case? What does that mean? And try to answer the question, why are these first principles unknowable? So we'll get there by the end. But let's first review where we've been so far, and recall what we've said in the past about epistemology. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, but more specifically, as we've looked at it, it's asking, what does our knowledge stand on? What anchors our knowledge? What can we build the system of philosophy on that's rock solid, right? If you're going to build a house, then logic and all those kind of things can be the tools to build this house of philosophy. But we need to build it on something rock solid, right? Something firm, something that we can rely on, something real, so that then we can build this whole system of knowledge on top of it and feel comfortable and certain about what we know. So this is why we're interested in this question: what does knowledge stand on? But as we saw, right, even the word epistemology is related to the word piste, faith or belief, right? We have faith. What gives us faith in our knowledge? What gives us confidence in our knowledge? So that our knowledge, if we're really comfortable in what we know, then what we know should stand up to, questioning, right? We should be comfortable enough in what we know to be able to question ourselves and allow what we know to be open for question, because that's what gives us confidence, right? That it's right and that it's true and that it's truth, all those kind of things. So what gives our knowledge, what gives us faith and confidence in our knowledge? As we also saw, it's related to this word epistasis, which is a particular kind of knowing, or really a particular kind of unknowing, right? If we're in a situation where we're in danger or we're uncertain about the reality around us, where we're questioning what we know, do we know enough? What's going to happen? It's this anxiety about what is going to happen. In fact, that word, means anxiety, and anxiety about our responsibility to respond as we are able to the situation, whatever it is. And so that gives us a desire to know what's going on, right? I want to know what's going to happen. I want to know the things around me, or an awareness of my surroundings. And if I don't have that certainty, if I'm uncomfortable with what's going on, then that gives me anxiety because I don't know what's going to happen or how I'm going to be able to respond to it. Right? So it's another reason we want to have some sort of confidence or faith in what we know, which is why we need this anchor, something to anchor or ground our knowledge, all knowledge. And hopefully leading us to some sort of hypostasis. Hypostasis, another word related to this one etymologically and also epistemologically, which just simply means understanding, right? So in other words, we want something that our understanding can be grounded in, but we need to remember that what makes understanding is precisely that understanding stands under truth, right? So truth is always going to be beyond what we can know. Truth is always going to exceed understanding. Truth is beyond understanding, right? Just from grammatical, that's just what the word means, right? So understanding stands under truth. Nevertheless, we want to try and find, or maybe for that very reason, we want to understand what can ground our knowledge, right? So that we can get to a higher understanding, and that alleviates our anxiety and gives us more confidence in our ability to make decisions, right? Particularly the decisions about what's the meaning and purpose of my life, and am I taking actions that are fulfilling that, or am I just wandering and meandering through life, just daily getting closer and closer to death with no real meaning or those kind of depressing kind of thoughts. So we want something that can ground our understanding, something that can anchor our understanding and anchor our knowledge. So how do we find that? Well, like I said, all philosophers have been on a quest to try and find this, and many philosophers have thought they found it. And one of those philosophers who thought he found it was this kid named René Descartes. Descartes came along, and from what I understand, Descartes was raised in a particular household, as we all are. And then when he became an adult, he learned that a lot of the things that he thought were true were not true. And he began to, then that shook his confidence, right? It gave him sort of an existential crisis about wondering what is true and what's not true. I've learned all these things and I thought they were true, and now I'm grown up and I realize they ain't true. So, what is true, and how do we find out what's true? So what Descartes wanted to do, he wanted to start over. Like, let's start philosophy over. Let's get down to brass tacks. Let's start from the very basics, and try and find something real, something that can't be doubted, something that's beyond all doubt. And so he was looking for something indubitable. So he's asking this question, what anchors knowledge? And in that quest, he's looking for something indubitable. In meaning not able to be doubted, right? Not able to be doubted. Now, Descartes was a radical skeptic, as most good philosophers are. He's very skeptical, right? And for the reasons that I already said, because he learned that some of the things that he thought were true weren't true. So then he became skeptical of everything else and wanted to know, all right, what is true? What is something that is beyond all doubt, something that we cannot doubt? And so he began to think about all the things that we can doubt. And he said, when we think about what is real, I'm reminded of, every time I think about Descartes, I think about The Matrix. I mean, I think about The Matrix a lot just in general, but this is one of those times that when I'm acutely reminded of this particular scene from the original Matrix, wherein Neo has just come out of the Matrix and he doesn't understand. He wants to know what the Matrix is. And then Morpheus takes him into this computer program, right? This virtual reality. And Neo says something like, what do you mean we're in a computer program right now? None of this is real?
This isn't real.
To which Morpheus responds, what do you mean by real? What is real?
How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see.
If by real, you mean things that you can see, things that you can hear, things that you can taste, things that you can touch, right? Then what is real is simply electrical impulses that are sent to your brain.
Then real is simply Electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
Giving you sensation that these things are occurring, right? That's how sensation happens. We receive photons that excite rods and cones in our eyes. We receive sound waves that vibrate the membranes in our inner ear, which cause electrical signals to be sent to our brain. When we touch something, right? Electrical signals, biochemical neurotransmitters are sent along axons and dendrites to our brainstem, which then recreates that sensation or creates that sensation, right? That we're feeling something. So as Morpheus points out, if what you mean by real is what you can see, taste, touch, smell, I think I left one out, then real just means electrical signals that are sent to your brain, right? So then what do we mean by real? Well, Descartes didn't see the Matrix, but he actually wrote a lot of the philosophy that is used in the Matrix. And one of the things that Descartes said was, how do I know that I'm not just a brain in a vat, right? Like very much like the Matrix, where maybe I'm just a brain in a jar of fluid, and some demon is like causing all these electrical signals to go into my brain so that I think that this is happening when it's not actually really happening in, IRL or whatever. But what does that even mean? Right? So he said, then I can doubt the existence of everything, doubt the existence of the world, right? I can doubt the existence even of my own body, he said, right? I can doubt even the existence of my own body. Maybe I'm just a brain or a consciousness on a computer somewhere, or something like that. This was obviously before computers, but Descartes would have jumped right on that train, right? So what is one thing that is beyond all doubt? And he realized that the one thing that he couldn't doubt was the fact that there is a doubter, right? He said, I can doubt everything except that I am doubting. So he reasoned, like, even if there is some like demonic force or devil or something that is putting my brain in this vat and is deceiving me to the fact that I have a body or that I live in this world, or deceiving me about everything that I see, hear, taste, touch, smell, all those kind of things. The one thing that I cannot doubt is that at least this demon has given me the ability to be, right? So at least as long as I am doubting, I cannot doubt that there is someone who's doubting, and that doubter is me. Which then, one step later, he takes that to his most famous conclusion, which is a different way of saying what I just said, which is in Latin, ego cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So Descartes was searching for something indubitable, something that was not able to be doubted. He came to this realization, I cannot doubt that I am doubting, and then, therefore, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore, I am. I think, therefore, I am. In other words, how does this answer the, all right, so how does that answer the question, what anchors our knowledge? Descartes focuses on the knower and says, well, the knower is this I am the knower. And I exist, I think, therefore I am, therefore I am the anchor. So in other words, what anchors knowledge? For Descartes, knowledge is anchored in the knower. I think, therefore I am. And then from there, but that doesn't prove that the world that I see is real. But nevertheless, he goes then in his second meditation, talk about the existence of God. This deceiver, this creator that created my consciousness wouldn't be a deceiver. What would be the point of that? Therefore, it's not the strongest argument ever, but it's an argument. Therefore, this creator must be good, and therefore has given me the ability to perceive, through seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, through my perception, has given me the ability to perceive the world, and therefore, right, we've answered all these questions. So then the knower knows knowledge, which is perceived to be true because of the existence of the creator, which has created this knower with the ability to know, in other words, right? But everything's anchored for Descartes in the existence of the knower. Fine. So, it's an answer. Is it a good answer? Well, No, it's not a good answer. It was a convincing answer for a long time, or for not that long, but it was a convincing answer for a while until this kid named David Hume came along. David Hume said, bullshit. Said, this is all, this doesn't, that's not right. It's not right. He said, what Descartes has proven is the existence of this knower, right? Fine. But that doesn't mean that the knower is always the same. It doesn't mean that the knower is really real and really unchanging. In fact, he said, isn't this knower constantly changing? This knower seems to change at every moment. In fact, this knower seems to change every time it knows something different, right? So the knower knows knowledge. So every time the knowledge changes, so does the knower. Right? So the knower is defined by what the knower knows, by the knowledge, by the content of the knower. So that's how we define these two things, right? They're mutually constitutive correlates, as we'll study later. They're MCCs, mutually constitutive correlates. Don't worry about that now. We'll come back to it later, but it'll be important for later, right? Knower and knowledge mutually constitute one another. You can't have one without the other, and knowledge constantly changes, which means that the knower constantly changes, right? So this can't be the anchor. So argues Hume, right? They can't be the anchor. Hume, just following Hume's logic a little bit further, right? He says that, what do we mean by this word I, right? So Descartes has said, I think, therefore I am. And Hume says, well, okay, fine, but what about this I? What do we mean by the word I? Hume says this I constantly changes. I, right now, 46-year-old Brad Bannon, I am not the same as I was when I was 4 minutes old, right? When I was 4 minutes old, I still have this name, Brad Bannon. But what about me is the same? My body is the same. My body is different. The cells of my body are different. My thoughts are different. My understanding of the world is different. My desires and passions are different. Everything about me is different. Is there anything other than my name, which was given to me after I was born? Is there anything that is the same? Right? So this I that I am right now is just very different than the I that it was at 4 minutes old, but also the I that I was even as an adult is quite different now than it was before I had kids, right? My understanding of myself, my understanding of the world, my understanding of my purpose, everything changed after kids, right? So I am just a very different person now than I was before I had kids. So this I constantly changes, and we might add to this or recognize from this that we also change based on context, right? I am different when I'm in a room alone talking to a video camera than when I am, with my kids playing a video game, or when I'm with my kids, eating dinner, or when I'm with my parents, or when I'm in a classroom, or when I'm with my friends hanging out, right? I am a different person in lots of different contexts. We all are, right? We perform our identity in various ways based on changing context. That's what it means to be a human person. So back to Descartes' anchor, like, wait, what is this anchor that's supposed to ground all knowledge? Is the I that is always there, but isn't it always constantly changing? Hume asked this question that many philosophers, very many philosophers prior have asked, many philosophers in all parts of the world have asked, which anybody who takes philosophy class gets some version of this question. But every time students hear this question, they just roll their eyes like, well, this is a stupid philosophy question. But the question is this: does a river exist? Does a river exist? Is that a dumb question? Does a river? You've seen a river, right? We've maybe swam in a river, crossed the river, driven over a river. You can find a river on a map and then go there and see it. So what kind of a question is that? Does a river exist? Well, when we start asking, what is the river? What is it that makes up the river, right? What do we mean when we use the word river, right? Even that river there, if we were next to a river. What is that river? Well, the river, isn't the river a flowing body of water? But the water that's in the river is constantly changing. It's there for a second, right? I mean, it's just going, and much of the river evaporates, and much of the river comes from condensation, right? So it creates its own little ecosystem. And so the water of the river, it's constantly changing. What about the river banks? Well, the banks of the river are constantly changing. They shift, maybe imperceptibly, but they shift significantly over time. The sediment that's on the bottom of the river is constantly being moved from here to there, right? So what is the river? Other than all of these things that are constantly changing, right? So the water is real, the water exists, but the water is changing from liquid to gas to liquid, right? Over and over, to solids too during the winter. So what is it about the river that makes it exist, other than all of these things that exist but don't, that make up the river but aren't exactly the river? So what is the river? You got the point? Hopefully you got the point. If it sounds like an eye roll, like philosophical question, but then apply it then to what we just did, right? So what does it mean to say I? In what way does the I exist, other than as this constantly changing bundles of perception, as Hume said, right? We've just got all of these different perceptions, and we bundle them together, particularly over time, to form memories and those sort of things. But howdy y'all, it's future Brad, editor Brad, interrupting here. Kind of the same Brad as that other guy who was lecturing, going on and on and on, but this Brad is concerned that Brad, who are different eyes, according to David Hume, that Brad didn't draw a clear connection between the river, right? Does the river exist, and what we might call stream of consciousness, right? Between the river and the stream. So we can ask the same question: does a river exist, or is it just the flowing stream of water, right? Endless stream of water particles that are constantly changing and changing and changing? Or likewise, does the mind exist, right? Do I exist, or is it just this stream of consciousness that's constantly going on and on and on and on and changing? So that, am I anything other than my thoughts? Would be the point. Things, but if you suffered a severe concussion and all of a sudden had radical amnesia, where you forgot your own name and you forgot your family members and you forgot everybody that you know, would you still be the same person, right? So then what is it that makes you you? You would still have the same mind and the same body, or would you? I mean, would you have the same? So what is it that is about this I? Whether or not we follow Hume on all of these points, we got to admit a few things. One, his argument is very logical. It's very based in evidence and logic and science and reason, and it doesn't have very many holes in it, right? It's also another thing we have to recognize, that is, it's radically different than what Descartes said, right? This unchanging I that is always there, that can anchor our understanding of the world, anchor all of our knowledge. So these are two mutually contradictory or seemingly contradictory perspectives. So how can they both be right? They are logically contradictory, and yet they're both logical, and both seem to resonate in differing ways with our experiences. So then what do we do? What do we do with that? Well, there are different philosophers do different things with that, as we'll see. And in a second, we'll look at what Kant said in his answer to the question. But we might also reflect on previous understanding we've had in this course of phenomenology, right? So we could say, well, what you see is a square with 2 dots, and what I see is a square with 5 dots. Who's right? Well, aren't they both? They're differing, right? They're logically and mutually contradictory, mutually exclusive, right? They can't both be true, and yet they both are true. And the reason that they're both true is because we're looking at the same thing from differing perspectives. So then why not understand, what Descartes has to say as speaking some, aspect of truth from one perspective, and what Hume says, even though it's radically different, still kind of having some resonance with our own experiences and understanding of the world. So what do we do with both of those things, recognizing that they contradict one another, right? Can't overlook that fact. Well, so Kant came around. Immanuel Kant came around, and they were at the same time Germany and England, or Scotland. Sorry, David Hume is Scottish, and so but Kant basically said, I mean, just a big eye roll and like, damn it, Hume's right. Hume makes a lot of good points. I don't like to admit it, but Hume makes a lot of good points, and he's kind of disproven what Descartes has to say. He's shown that this is, what anchors knowledge. Descartes said the knower. Hume destroyed that argument, right? So that can't be the case anymore. So we can't anchor our knowledge in the knower because Hume has given us reasons not to. So what do we do, right? Kant says, well, let's remember, says Kant, that we have to answer this question. Without anchoring our knowledge, then everything becomes relative, right? If there is no anchor for our knowledge, and our knowledge just shifts constantly like a river, then we can't be confident about any of our knowledge. We can't know anything. We can't have any certainty. We can't have any ethics, says Kant, right? It'll all just be chaos. Everybody will be depressed because there's no meaning or purpose to life. All this kind of stuff just from like an inability to find what anchors our knowledge, right? Because everything becomes relative. And if everything is relative, then nothing matters. And if nothing matters, then nothing matters, right? So we have to have some sort of anchor. Having an anchor for our knowledge is necessary. What kind of way, what way do we have out of this problem? It seems like we set out to solve a problem. What can we anchor our knowledge in? And we've only made it 10 times worse now. So Brad, what are you doing to us, right? What's the point? Well, Kant gave us a solution. We can evaluate it as we go, but let's just hear what his solution was. His solution was this. Just a warning, it's not going to be super satisfying, but this is what Kant reasoned. We have to anchor our knowledge, right? It's necessary. It's absolutely necessary. He went on to, hundreds of pages about why it's necessary for us to have an anchor for our knowledge. But he also went on for hundreds of pages admitting that we can't have an anchor for our knowledge. Why? Well, it says these first principles are inherently unknowable. Why? Because any basis that we have for knowledge is always going to be anchored in the knower, as Descartes has shown, right? But as Hume has shown, the knower is constantly changing. The knower is defined by what it knows. So therefore, it can't be the anchor for knowledge, and yet is, right? So Kant's points out, right? That's logically, what this means logically is that the first principles are unknowable. Whatever anchors knowledge is by definition going to be unknowable. If that doesn't make sense, then let me try explaining it this way, right? Whatever the basis or foundation for our knowledge is, if we knew it, then it would be knowledge. And then what would the basis for that knowledge be? If we knew it, that would be knowledge. And then what would the basis for that knowledge be? Well, if we knew it, then it would be knowledge. And what would you get the point, right? So we wind up into what philosophers call a pattern of infinite regress. Right, if we're trying to find what anchors knowledge, then whatever that anchor would be knowable, which means it would be knowledge, and then we need an anchor for it, right? So you can never find that thing. In fact, this seems to be as far as we can go, right? As Kant says, this is it, right? So knowledge is irreducible to this duality of knower and known, subject and object. To be a subject is to know some. To be a knower is to have knowledge, and knowledge only exists in the knower. So, this is as low as we can go. This is as fine as we can go, right? So therefore, says Kant, these first principles are unknowable. But again, they are necessary. So what do we do? If it's unknowable, but also necessary, then Kant's solution, here's the super unsatisfying part. Kant's solution is just to stipulate an answer. Just stipulate which one it is. In other words, he says, Descartes has given us lots of good reasons to anchor it in the knower. Hume has given us lots of good reasons not to anchor it in the knower. But we got to go with one, so let's go with Descartes. That's what Kant said, right? So we just need to stipulate, and we're going to stipulate what Descartes said, so we're going to anchor our knowledge in the knower. Why? Why would he do that, right? So he says, let's just anchor our knowledge in, we're going to stipulate. Fine, not super satisfying, but at least we understand why he's stipulating, right? It's like this. If you were gonna, let's say we're gonna play pickup basketball, right? Just street basketball with somebody. So, you could play make it, take it. You make a basket and then you get the ball back again, or you could not play make it, take it. You make the ball, make a basket, and then the other person gets the ball. Street ball, you can play it either way, right? Most people don't really care which way you play. Either way you play is fair as long as you're playing by the rule and keeping it consistent, right? Play that way, and those are the rules, and that's it. It doesn't matter whether you play make it, take it, or don't play make it, take it. But it does matter that you stipulate, right? So we got to decide ahead of time before the game starts, before anybody makes a basket, are we playing make it, take it or not, right? Because if you make a basket and then you decide, hey, let's play make it, take it, well, that's not fair, right? So you got to stipulate ahead of time, just pick one, right? So this is what Kant said. Let's just pick one. Let's go with Descartes. Why? Why would he choose Descartes, right? Descartes, it's a frustrating choice because Hume has already disproven it. So he's given arguments against it. It's not just that he's offered a different alternative or different option. He's already kind of like shown why this one can't be the case. So for that, we're going to have to dip our toes into more speculative area, right? Because we're trying to get into like Kant's head and why would he do something like that? And I think the answers, they're not racist. There's some reasons why that have to do with historical context that we should at least bring into consideration, like understanding the historical context and what was going on at that time, and particularly what might have been going on in Kant's head. So at Kant's time, so let's kind of take ourselves back to, this 18th century times, right? So in the 18th century, obviously you had slave trade going on and that sort of thing, and you have justification for all sorts of things. So a lot of theorization about how to run a society and who should vote and who shouldn't, and lots of those kind of questions going on at the time, and also slave trade and all sorts of things going on at the time, discovery of the New World and all these sort of things. Although it had been discovered for a bit before then, but nevertheless, at that time, if you've ever read Harry Potter, I'm a big Harry Potter fan. And Harry Potter at Hogwarts, in the library, they have what's called the restricted section. It's like, they're books and they're in the library and you can read them, but you got to get special permission to read them. Not everybody can read them. They're restricted, right? Only some people can read them. Well, back then, there was a restricted section in the library. There's some books that only some people were able to read, and maybe because they were only people that had the language ability to read them or whatever, because of what language they were in. That was the case. Also, this was, books were pretty rare back then, and a lot of books were handwritten. Anyway, there were a lot of reasons why there were sort of restricted books that very few people had read, but people at a high level of intellectual philosophy had read them, and Hume and Kant were some of those people, right? They had read these books in the restricted section. What books were in the restricted section? Well, primarily they were books written by brown people, right? Or black people. So they were written by people of color, and for various reasons, they just weren't included in the regular part of the library. So people weren't able to read them. They certainly weren't taught in philosophy classes, much like today. A lot of these texts are still not taught in philosophy in classes. And so there was a lot of there was a lot of censorship. And in fact, Kant wrote a lot about academic censorship and his frustration with the censorship that was going on at his, in Germany at that time. And he also wrote a lot in support of academic freedom. He felt like the professors, doctors who have a doctorate should be able to make doctrine, right? Should be able to teach and explain things, right? And explain truth as they've understood it based on their credentials, right? Their expertise and their philosophical understanding. They should be able to teach what they know, right? Without any sort of censorship. So Kant felt that back in this time, there wasn't a lot, professors didn't have tenure and that sort of stuff. And now there's a push to remove tenure from a lot of professors in longing to censor them, right? So that they can only teach what the church wants them to teach, or only teach what the government wants them to teach, or only teach what people in power want them to teach, and not teach anything that contradicts what those leaders in the church or leaders and political leaders that have a stake in it that want to censor those kind of things, right? So Kant was frustrated by the lack of academic freedom and the ongoing censorship that was going on at that time. Hume was also very frustrated by it, but Hume had an idea. Hume had a wicked, smart, sneaky little idea. He was a very clever bloke. He was involved in this poker society, the Poker Club, which is this group of Scottish philosophers and thinkers, including Adam Smith was in there. But anyway, Hume was he was a sneaky little guy, and so he thought, all right, what I'm going to do, I've read all these philosophy books, these Buddhist philosophy books written by scholars of Buddhism, or wrote about what the Buddha said. And, but I know that I'm not allowed, I'm censored from going and talking about these kind of things in classes or in publications. It's just, it won't be published. It'll be censored, right? You're not allowed. You get in trouble for doing that. So Hume's idea was, all right, I'm going to go and I'm going to teach all the things that the Buddha said, but I'm just going to put them in my own words, right? I'm just going to, do that. You could call it plagiarism, but I wouldn't want to attribute contemporary plagiarism rules to, time in which professors were absolutely censored from being able to talk about those things, right? So you can't judge him by rules that were very different and during his day. Anyway, so he just presented this stuff hey, look, I got this good idea. And then all these scholars read it and they're like, damn, this is some good ideas. There's really good points. You're so innovative. You're thinking about things in this radically different way that no white person has ever thought about before, right? So yay, awesome. And meanwhile, Kant knew what was going on. Kant had read these books too. He knew what was up, right? He knew what Hume was doing. And he knew that he was trying to get around these censorship laws, which probably Kant was cool with, right? But Kant faced his own restrictions in Germany and censorship there, primarily by the church, who had a lot at stake in Descartes' position, right? The immortality of the soul and being able to, say that there is some some soul that is the same from birth to death and beyond, right? And for just a few dollars, as coin and coffer tolls, the soul from purgatory springs. Wait, no, as coin and coffer rings, soul from purgatory springs, right? Those. Anyway, so that idea that there's a soul that's that the church is responsible for, that's completely in line with Descartes' position, but completely contrary to Hume's position. And so Kant said, well, we got to just pick one. We're going to go with this one. Also, because then what do we do with things like slavery or things, right? What if people can change? What if the nature of the knower is something so fluid that anyone, is just a product of their environment and upbringing and not a matter of birth or, burying the soul in this, fallen bodies, all those things that Thomas Aquinas said, women are inferior because it's the soul being, born in this. So, there's a lot at stake in this decision, and Kant wants everything to just go the way that things have been, right? So we've been following Descartes, so we have to have an answer, we have to have an anchor, so let's stipulate an answer, and Descartes' given us one, so let's just stick with that, even though Hume has already given us a lot of reasons why it's not true. So there's an answer, right? Like I said, this is just a meta-narrative history. You know, we could argue different points, but nevertheless, this is sort of the history of why these first principles of philosophy are unknowable, and also why these first principles of philosophy are so utterly necessary, why we need them to avoid things like relativism and that kind of stuff. But, you know, we can't overlook the fact that you know, Descartes' position of putting the anchor in the knower is kind of like it's problematic, right? At the least. So then what do we do with that? We still need an anchor. We haven't solved the problem. We've only made the problem worse. Well, I think there's multiple different answers to that. Of course, there's a lot of different answers to that question. One answer would be to maybe put the anchor right here, right? And to recognize that maybe you just can't simplify it more than this. Maybe the anchor is that you know, contextualized, Dasein ist Mitsein, das ist Mitsein in Welt. Forget all that German. That the self is the knower in the world, and we can't be some disembodied knower outside of the world. To be a knower is to be a knower in the world, and that's just as simple as it gets, right? So that is the anchor of our experience. But then how do we avoid solipsism and all those kind of things? How can we then understand the reality of the world or something bigger than us? Well, there are other answers to that question which we could look for, but regardless, they're all going to require that we anchor our knowledge in something more than just this at an individual level, right? But that we anchor it in some third thing, something that is rock solid, that's neither the knower or what is known, right? Because then we wind up in infinite regress where the knowledge is always going to be, right? But at the same time, even if we find some third thing, that third thing, we're going to have to recognize its unknowability, because if it becomes known, then it becomes static, it becomes no longer real and unchanging. So what do we do? Where can we anchor that? Where can we anchor that? Well, there's another answer. To get there, I want to take you through another quick little history. But I'm going to pause and then we'll come to that.
Are you sick and tired of philosophy professors telling you that knowledge lacks epistemic grounding in reality? Are you fed up with teenagers who keep trying to walk on the sky instead of staying in their damn place? If so, Epi Boots are for you. Strap in and strap on some leather that will firmly anchor your ideology in the same place it's always been anchored, in the past. Our boots are made the way boots have always been made, by impoverished Bangladeshi children. Our boots are guaranteed to leave 2 pairs of footprints in the sand. Epi Boots. Boots that keep you grounded.
Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you took a nice little mental break, because it's a long lecture, a lot of content in here, and if we were in the classroom, you know, I'd stop and tell a story or dad jokes or something like that. Anyway, so now what I want to do is give an alternative of where we can place this anchor, right? So we've seen why we can't place it in the knower. Obviously, we can't place it in the knowledge, and therefore we get in this pattern of infinite regress, as Kant has shown. And Kant's answer is just to stipulate an answer, and he's not wrong in that. Even though it may be unsatisfying, we still need one, so we have to stipulate something to avoid falling into some relativistic pattern. And Kant chose Descartes' position for a number of different reasons, but we don't necessarily have to do that. But instead, can look for an alternative. And one alternative is in what we call theology. So my training is in theology. I consider myself a theologian first and a philosopher second, but my theology is very philosophical, as you might imagine. But this word can be easily misunderstood. What the word theology means, and what people mean when they use that can often be very different things. So let's clarify. Let's get a sense of what this word theology actually means in this context and how we're going to use it in this course. To do that, we're going to I want to give you another meta-narrative history, run through 1,000 years of philosophy in just a few minutes. This history of the academy. So the academy was founded by this kid named Plato. Well, actually, he wasn't named Plato. Plato was just a nickname. Plato means the broad-shouldered one. Not sure what his actual given name was, but we just know him as Plato by his nickname. And so Plato, maybe not necessarily a student of Socrates in the traditional sense, but he was very inspired by Socrates and wrote all these dialogues involving Socrates, who was a real historical person, and who Plato became familiar through his trial. He was present at his trial. Socrates was murdered by the government. He was executed by the state because of his philosophy. And Plato was there at that trial, observing it, and wrote down everything that Socrates said. We have a very good, reliable account of Socrates' words through Plato from that event. But anyway, Plato wrote this series of dialogues. And later in this semester, we're going to look at one of these dialogues in particular, the Phaedrus dialogue, which is a dialogue between Socrates and this kid named Phaedrus. And so we'll come back to that, but Plato wrote dialogues. Everything he wrote was in the form of dialogues. Why? Because Socrates, who he followed closely, said that philosophy is a mode of discourse, right? It has to be done through dialogue, like in your podcasts assignments and in the form that I can't do when I'm in a room alone talking to a camera. But philosophy is a mode of discourse done through dialogue. So Plato wrote these dialogues down, intending them to be more as like a model to follow, right? Something as an example. This is how you do philosophy, and these dialogues can be a good starting point. But then the philosophy comes after, reading them and being in dialogue with them and being in dialogue with one another around these dialogues. And so Plato not only wrote these dialogues, but he also founded an actual school, which is just simply called the Academy. And it was an actual place, and above the door of the Academy was this sign that said, "None shall enter here who do not know mathematics." Mathematics, as we'll see I'll go back over that again, but when we get to logic, right? Logic and mathematics are the same, really. So you can't think logically without mathematics, and to think mathematically is to think logically. So none shall enter here who do not know mathematics, and that was above the door of the Academy. Now, of course, Plato he didn't just found the Academy, but also the leader of it, right? So if you went to study at the Academy, you'd study with Plato. He was the teacher there. After Plato died, though, kind of a rival, not really a student, but a rival of his, named Aristotle, took over the Academy, because he was very well-known philosopher at the time, with a very different perspective on pretty much everything as compared to Plato, including how to do philosophy. So whereas Plato wrote dialogues, Aristotle wrote monologues, these long treatises and texts, that were his own thoughts and his own way of doing philosophy, but not in dialogue with others. Then you've got a lot of folks come after him, we're just going to ... yada, yada, yada through, a few 100 years until we get to this kid named Plotinus. And Plotinus was another leader of the Academy. When he took over, he was really distraught. He was really frustrated with how philosophy had been done in the Academy. It just seemed like every new leader that took over the Academy just did their own thing, and there wasn't any consistency or coherency, and it was just changed all the time. And so Plotinus was frustrated by this and wanted to get back to the kind of philosophy that Plato was doing. So he really put Plato's writings, these dialogues, at the center of his philosophy, and organized everything around his reading of those texts, writing commentaries on those texts, and dialogue with those texts, thinking about those texts across from one text to the other, and really systematically trying to come up with a philosophy that's built and grounded in all these Platonic dialogues. And then shortly after him was another philosopher, Proclus, who really took it even a step farther and wrote all these commentaries on all these texts, including commentaries on Plotinus's works, and wrote a book called The Elements of Theology. So The Elements of Theology is a book written by Proclus, and in that, he not only gives a sort of systematic, very systematic philosophy, but it's a systematic philosophy that's grounded in the texts of Plato as an anchor, right? So it's not anchored in a knower or in knowledge or anything like that. It's anchored in a specific set of texts, which then become the canon, right? You can argue whatever you want to, but you have to argue within the canon of Plato's texts, right? So if you want to argue your own perspective, you can do that, of course, right? But it needs to be an interpretation of what's there. So these texts are certainly open to interpretation. They're dialogues, right? So you have differing perspectives. So how much weight do you give to Socrates' position, or how much do you give to Parmenides' position, who destroys Socrates and his in the dialogue with Parmenides. So usually Socrates is the hero. He's the victor of all these debates and conversations, but he usually is victorious on the grounds of the theory of forms, which we'll look at a little bit later, except for in one text where Socrates loses this argument to Parmenides, and it's all centered on the theory of the forms. So the one thing that causes Socrates to win all of his arguments, he loses on. So then what do you do with that, right? Do you put more weight on the Parmenides dialogue, or do you put less weight on it, or do you deal with the complexity and the frustrating aspect of philosophy as it is? Proclus basically said, well, you can do any of that, right? But you have to do it in conversation with the text. So the texts are what anchor our philosophical conversation. So we can argue differing positions from our varying perspectives, but they need to be perspectives on this particular canon of text, right? That's something that anchors our understanding, anchors our knowledge. What we're trying to do, as Proclus pointed out, is what matters is not just this dichotomy, this subject-object, knower, knowledge, mutually constitutive correlates, as we'll look at later. But this is also, remember when we studied epistemology the first time around, we talked about these various ways of knowing, right? Focusing again on another dialogue by Plato of Book 6 of the Republic, where Socrates lays out his divided line, these various ways of knowing, intellectual ways of knowing, rational knowledge, rational knowing, sensual knowing, and imaginative knowing, right? So these four are very differing kinds of knowing that aren't, necessarily in a hierarchy, but they're very different, right? To know a person sensually is different than to know them through conversation and rational discussion, which is different than knowing something intellectually, right? So that intellect is something higher than this dichotomy, which is something that Plotinus goes into great detail about, but still trying to anchor, how do we anchor our discourse so that we can get up to that intellectual knowing? It's got to be anchored in something, right? As we've well established numerous times throughout all of this, we need an anchor, something that will ground our knowledge, something for our knowledge to stand on, something that we can have faith in so that we won't have anxiety about what we don't know, right? So we need to have, and so that we don't fall into relativistic ethics or relativistic knowledge, which is depressing and nihilistic, right? So we need something to anchor our knowledge, and Proclus here is using that word theology to refer to this body, it's theology so long as it has Plato's dialogues at the center, right? And then we can all have something, some basis, some anchor, something to anchor the conversation, right? So maybe this is overstating the points, or maybe it'll just be the clarification that you need to understand. But right, this basically what Proclus and Plotinus are doing are taking the dialogues of Plato, putting them at the center of the circle so that we can all have our differing perspectives on the text, but what anchors our conversation in this quest for truth, this quest for wisdom, is something tangible, something that doesn't change, right? So that's the advantage of the dialogues of Plato, is that they don't change. They're there, right? We all have them. We can all read them. Some of us know Greek, so we can read them a little bit better. Some people know Greek better, so they can read them better. Right? We can all have differing knowledge of the texts, but at least the texts are there and they're static and they don't change, and then those can be an anchor for our conversation. So we need to stipulate, as Kant said, stipulate something that can anchor it. And Proclus has stipulated the writings of Plato, right? So a body of texts. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, before we get to what's wrong with it, or the challenges that it presents, maybe a better way of saying, before we get to that, I want to reflect on this word theology, right? So there is this word theology. Theos here can refer to this one, sort of like one intellect, overarching intellect, which is kind of how Plotinus took it. But it also, as many other philosophers have pointed out, Nicholas of Cusa among them, the word etymologically is related to the word theoro. Theoro simply means to see. And theoro is where we get the word theory, right? So we could understand this anchor as something, right? We all have our differing theories, our differing ways of seeing, but we're all looking at the same thing, right? The thing with the die is we can understand the differences of our perspectives, why you're seeing something different than I'm seeing, because we understand that the thing itself is the same thing, right? You're seeing something different and I'm seeing something different, but we're both seeing the same thing just from differing perspectives. But how do you know if you're talking about truth or intellect or knowledge or the purpose of life? How do you know that you're looking at the same thing, right? Just from differing perspectives? In order to do that, we need something to anchor the conversation. And so these texts can be a way to anchor that conversation so that we use words similarly, we can define words similarly, we can understand the text. Doesn't mean that we have to agree with the text or that we can see things differently, but we have to make our arguments grounded in the text. That's what anchors the conversation. It's our different ways of seeing things, right? Now, hopefully, as you're hearing that, you're recognizing the challenge here. The challenge, of course, is how do you pick that canon of text, right? So we can have common discourse, something that anchors our conversation, but who gets to decide what anchors the conversation? Who gets to decide that canon of text? Who gets to decide what's in it and what's out of it, right? How do we make those decisions? And traditionally, white philosophers have made those decisions based on what white philosophers have done before, right? But we could ask that question again, like we need something that anchors our conversations, but what's at stake in how we choose that anchor? What's at stake in how we build this canon that can be common, for us to see differing perspectives on these fundamental questions: anthropology, cosmology, and theology. What do we mean? What's the meaning and purpose of life? Who am I? Where am I? Who are you? How do we understand one another? And what's our meaning and purpose of existence, right? So these fundamental first principles of knowledge, in order to investigate those, we need some sort of anchor. We can't put it in the knower, as Descartes did, and as Hume said, we can't put it in the knowledge, right? Because those two things are mutually constitutive correlates. They change with one another, so they can't really be an anchor. So we need some third thing, and as Kant says, these really is necessary. We can't just overlook this problem. We need to stipulate something as our anchor. Maybe one answer is to think about a common canon of text that can be that anchor, right? Or in your podcast episodes, it's much more simple, right? Because you've got the content of the course. So then as long as you're talking about anything that's from the content of the course, you can understand that content of the course from differing perspectives. That's the whole point, right? But what makes the conversation meaningful and grounded is that you're grounding it in the content of the course, right? So that's what anchors your podcast discussions. But there again, like I'm the one who chose the content, so there's a lot of power in that decision. What's at stake in that decision? What texts to put at the center? What texts to leave out? Why do Hume instead of the Buddhist text, right? So there's a lot at stake in those decisions, and some of those have already been made with how administrators name courses, et cetera, et cetera. Nevertheless, we need something to anchor our conversation, so we need some sort of common set of texts that can anchor it. Proclus has suggested the dialogues of Plato, and so we're going to use some of the dialogues of Plato to anchor our discussions. But recognizing that if we chose differing anchors to anchor our conversation, then our understanding of truth and ourselves and the world around us would be different. So maybe that even is part of the answer. But I think that's more than enough to help us understand why. So just to review the central exam questions, right? On the syllabus, I have several exam questions that come from chapter 5. First one simply is, what are the first principles of philosophy? So cosmology, anthropology, theology, or existentialism. Those fundamental questions: who am I? Where am I? Why am I here? The next exam question is, why are these first principles unknowable? And hopefully you've got good understanding of that, right? They're unknowable because we can't, because if we knew what that anchor was, then it would be knowledge. And then we could ask the question, what anchors that knowledge? And then if that were knowable, then what anchors that knowledge? So we wind up in infinite regress. In other words, the first principles of knowledge are by definition unknowable. They're by definition beyond knowledge, or even under knowledge. They're the basis or foundation for knowledge. One of the ways I explained it in class that I haven't mentioned in this video is that, if you were to ask, think about the source of a river and a river, right? The source of the river is not the river. If it were the river, then it would be the river and not the source of rivers. There's a difference between the source of the river and the river, right? Or you could think about it in terms of a house, like the foundation, you have to build your house on something. You want to build your house on something solid rock that's not going to move, right? But that solid rock that's under there that you build the house on is not the house. It's the basis for the house, the foundation. I mean, I know we build foundations now, but still you still have to build the foundation on something solid, right? It's why you dig down to find solid rock below the frost line, all those kind of things, right? So what is the basis for the house is not the house. What the source of the river is not the river. Likewise, the anchor, what founds or what's the basis for knowledge is not knowledge. It is not knowable. It is beyond knowledge or underneath knowledge, precisely for the reason that because it is the foundation or the basis of knowledge. Therefore, it is unknowable. But as Kant pointed out, we still need it, still necessary. So then how do we stipulate? What do we pick to choose? Well, that leads us to the third exam question. How is theology different from other kinds of philosophy? And the answer is that theology picks a particular canon of texts to anchor the conversation. And the advantage of that is that that canon of text doesn't change, right? We can argue our differing perspectives on those texts. We can interpret and reinterpret them as times change, as context changes, as people change. Because at the core, what these philosophical dialogues do is raise more questions than they do answers. And they give us ways of thinking through issues, right? Tools that we can use to think through issues, which is why they're useful century after century after century, right? Millennia after millennia at this point. Which is why they make good foundational texts to hold at the center. But then the question becomes, who gets to decide what goes into that canon? There's a lot of power at stake in that decision. What gets included, what gets left out? Those questions, well, that maybe takes us beyond what we can cover here. So that concludes chapter 5, first principles. Next time we're going to dig into logic and start thinking about not just what is the basis for our knowledge, but then begin to construct systems of knowing on top of this basis that we still haven't quite found yet, right? But at least understand the tools for doing so and the difference between logic, rhetoric, and aesthetics. So that wraps up chapter 5, and hope that it made some sense, and hope that it's not too dark in here. I have the lights pretty low, but doing the best I can with this whole video expert thing, whatever, which I'm not. So anyway, hope it made sense. Peace out.